guys, so in today's video, I want to address this question of why is the God of the Old Testament so seemingly evil in comparison to the God of the New Testament? Stay tuned.
And the devil said, "Every firstborn son in Egypt will die, from the firstborn son of Pharaoh, who sits on the throne, to the firstborn son of the female slave, who is at her handmill, and all the firstborn of the cattle as well." Actually, that wasn't the devil. That was God. Surprise! He just killed all the firstborn children and innocent babies that have done nothing wrong, even killing the firstborn of the cattle. That is fucking insane. Does this sound like a God of love to you?
So it's become kind of popular to resurrect this sort of Marcion heresy, right? Marcion was an early Christian in the early church who suggested that the God of the Old Testament was not the same as the God of the New Testament. He said, you know, if you look at the legalism, you look at the cruelty, you look at the malice of the God of the Old Testament, it's absolutely irreconcilable with the God of Jesus, right? The God of Jesus is a God of love and mercy and forgiveness. And you look at the God of the Old Testament and it seems to be quite the obvious. You know, some people have even gone so far as to suggest that the God of the Old Testament is the devil. This, in fact, is the primary idea that stands behind Gnosticism, right? The Gnostics suggested that the God of the Old Testament was the devil, that they called a demiurge. There's a fascinating passage, or set of passages in the Bible that really helps us segue into this and to recognize the biblical understanding of Satan. If we look at 2 Samuel 24, verse 1, we read, "Again, the anger of the Lord was aroused against Israel, and he," that's to say the Lord, "moved David against them to say, 'Go, number Israel and Judah.'" Now, to give you some context, what's being described here is the fact that basically the Bible describes that God tempts David into committing a sin, of censusing Israel, of getting a census on Israel, which was something prohibited in the Torah. And as a consequence, David is persecuted. He suffers under the wrath of God. Now, naturally, you know, you can kind of recognize there's a bit of a problem in this, right? So, wait a minute. God, you know, tempts David into committing a sin and then punishes him for the same sin? That doesn't sound like the activity of a just God, right? And so for this reason, in the book of 1 Chronicles, which was written later, we see the same story told, but there's a small change. If we look at 1 Chronicles 21, verse 1, we read, "Satan rose up against Israel and incited David to take a census." Well, hang on a second. Right? That's a pretty big difference. And in fact, atheists and skeptics and critics, they love to point this out because they say it's an example of a contradiction in the Bible. But in fact, I'm going to show you here in these next few Bible passages that in fact we're not looking at a contradiction at all, but rather something which is deeply mysterious. And we've got to recognize a distinction between the providential will of God and the immanent or sovereign will of God. The sovereign will of God is the will of God that we have relayed to us through the commandments, right? Where God is relating to us what it is he wills imminently in our lives. That's to say, obey moral laws, do what's right. But there's also the providential will of God that works and orders all things in accordance with the will of God. Now, I think the best description to explain this providential will of God comes to us in the works of Julian of Norwich. Julian of Norwich was a well-known anchorite in England, I believe in the 12 or 1373 to be exact. And she was an anchorite, meaning she was put into an isolated chamber, wherein which she was put in, built into this structure that was basically attached to the church, cut off from the community. And so in isolation, in solitude, in fasting, in prayer, literally locked inside of this cloister, she was exposed to basically altered states of consciousness and in the pursuit of revelations of God. And this book, her Revelations on Divine Love, is her relating these revelations that she received while she was locked inside of this cloister. She was brought right to the very point of death, and then that was then that the visions of Christ started to come to her, and she received a series of these revelations. Now, there's one revelation in here, the fifth revelation that she receives, that really speaks to our topic. It says here In this, our Lord revealed a part of the devil's malice and all his powerlessness, for he showed that his passion is the devil's defeat. That's to say, Christ's crucifixion is the devil's defeat. God showed that the devil still has the same malice that he had before the incarnation, and he works as hard, and just as continually. He sees all those souls who will be saved escape him gloriously through the power of Christ's precious passion. And this is his sorrow, and very badly humiliates him. For everything that God allows him to do turns into joy for us, and to shame and misery for him. And he has as much sorrow when God gives him permission to work as when he is not working. And that is because he can never do as much evil as he would like, for all his power is under lock and key in God's hand. But there can be no anger in God, as it seems to me, for our good Lord has regard eternally for his own glory and the benefit of all who shall be saved. With power and justice he withstands the reprobates, who out of malice and malignity busy themselves to scheme and act against God's will. I saw also that our Lord scorns the devil's malice and discounts him as powerless, and he wants us to do the same. Now this really, you talk about contrast with the Old Testament, right? Where Julian of Norwich is saying there is no wrath in God. There is no anger in God. Well, there goes the Torah. The Torah is filled with examples of God's wrath, right? So what are we talking about? What are we describing? Well, again, let's go back to the scriptures. I think one of the best passages for explaining this seeming contradiction in the scriptures, as well as within tradition, is when we look at the book of Job. Right? The book of Job tells us a story of Job, and it says that God calls an assembly of all God's angels in Job chapter 1. And it says that Satan comes into the assembly of God's angels, and God says to the devil, he says, have you considered my servant Job, how righteous and austere and moral and upright he is, right? And Satan says to God, he says, he's only that way because you look after him. He says, if you took away from him all of his wealth and prosperity, Job would curse you to your face. And God says, you think so, eh? So he says, I tell you what, I'll give you control over everything Job owns, and then we'll see who's actually right. And so the devil goes, and he's given permission. Note that he's given permission by God to test and tempt Job by destroying everything he owns. And so the Sabians come in, and Job's family, many members of his family die, right? It's this horrible situation. And then we read in Job chapter 1, naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I will depart. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. May the name of the Lord be praised. Now notice something, that Job says that the Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. He doesn't say the Lord gave, and then the devil took away, even though that's exactly what happened. You see? Right? The devil is the one who took Job's property away. The text tells us that clearly, right? But ultimately, the activity of Satan is recognized as the Lord's will because the devil cannot act without the consent of God, without the consent of God's will. I think one of the best examples of this to further this point is when we look at the crucifixion of Christ. In Luke chapter 22, verses 3 through 6, we read, "Then Satan entered into the heart of Judas Iscariot, who was one of the 12 apostles." And it's from there that Judas goes on and he betrays Christ. So it's clear, and the Gospel of John echoes this as well. It's clear that the arrest and crucifixion of Jesus was the work of the devil. But we've just read in Julian of Norwich that the crucifixion of Jesus was the defeat of the devil. Why would the devil help the apostle Judas in betraying Christ in order to defeat himself? Because the devil was acting out of malice and rebelliousness. He was seeking to undermine the power and authority of Christ. But inadvertently, through the providential will of God, he in fact undermined and destroyed himself. So that the devil was the architect of his own destruction. We see this stated clearly in Acts chapter 2, verse 23, where St. Peter, speaking to the Jews, says, "This man," that's to say Jesus, "was handed over to you by God's deliberate plan and foreknowledge." So it was not just the work of the devil to crucify Christ. It was God's deliberate plan and foreknowledge. So what are we talking about, right? What are we describing? Are we saying that the devil is God's, dirty hand, so to speak, right? Whenever God's got to do some dirty work in the world, he, reaches in with the devil and does it? Well, no, that's not it at all. What really we're describing here is the fact that when God's presence retreats, when God's presence leaves a space, It's that space that the devil enters into. So where the presence of God no longer is, the presence of the devil comes in. And the devil then has the free range to cause chaos and destruction as he sees fit. But even his rebellious actions serve to fulfill the providential will of God, so that God is supreme in all and through all. He is truly the one without a second. To further explain this, I want to read for you guys a couple of really beautiful passages out of the Catechism of the Catholic Church. Paragraph 310, we read, "But why did God not create a world so perfect that no evil could exist in it? God freely willed to create a world in a state of journeying towards its ultimate perfection." In other words, God created the world in a condition where we have the choice to participate with him in creating a perfect reality. And in the Latin, this is in statu vi, right? It's this idea that we are in participation with God in helping to bring about this created world, right? Which is really, it's extraordinary. It's wonderful if you think about it, where, our suffering and our sorrow is temporary, but ultimately, if we cooperate with the will of God, then we become inheritors. We come to inherit that perfect world which is destined for those who love God and obey his commandments. But even if we choose to rebel, ultimately we still fulfill the will of God in bringing about this perfect reality. In paragraph 311 we read, "God is in no way directly or indirectly the cause of moral evil. He permits it, however, because he respects the freedom of his creatures and mysteriously knows how to derive good from it. St. Augustine writes, 'For Almighty God, because he is supremely good, would never allow any evil whatsoever to exist in his works if he were not so all-powerful and good as to cause good to emerge from evil itself.'" Paragraph 312 we read, "It was not you, said Joseph to his brothers, who sent me here, but God. You meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive." So that what is being quoted here is the story of Joseph in Egypt, right? Where the 11 brothers of Joseph throw Joseph into a well and they intend him evil. They try to murder him, and he's then taken by Egyptian slave traders who take him down into Egypt. And as a direct consequence, he actually becomes a royal official in Egypt and saves the rest of his family from the famine which plagues the central Near East at that time. So that even the evil actions of Joseph's brothers actually come to fulfill the greater good through the will of God. This is a theme that we see again and again throughout the scriptures, that even when the devil, or even when some human being does something with an evil intention, God in his infinite wisdom works it out in order to bring about a greater good for the world and for everyone who loves God and obeys his commandments. In the Catechism, paragraph 599, we read, "Jesus' violent death was not the result of chance in an unfortunate coincidence of circumstances, but is part of the mystery of God's plan. This biblical language does not mean that those who handed him over were merely passive players in a scenario written in advance by God. To God, all moments of time are present in their immediacy. When, therefore, he establishes his eternal plan of predestination, he includes in it each person's free response to his grace. In this city, in fact, both Herod and Pontius Pilate, with the Gentiles and the peoples of Israel, gathered together against your holy servant Jesus, whom you anointed, to do whatever your hand and your plan had predestined to take place. For the sake of accomplishing his plan of salvation, God permitted the acts that flowed from their blindness." So this is really, essentially what the Catechism is telling us, is that God, in his total omniscience and omnipotence and his total omnipresence, right? He knows and understands all things. He plans history in such a way that even the free actions chosen by sinners ultimately work together in accordance with his will and his plan. So that when Pontius Pilate and the Jews and all of the officials of the Roman system of government and the Sanhedrin and all of them, when they rebelled against God and crucified his Messiah, even this was taken into account. And God, in his infinite foreknowledge, used their free choice in such a way as to direct things in accordance with his will. It's still their free choice. It's just that God knows the human heart, and all moments in time are immediate to his presence. So that every choice is not made in advance. Rather, it's that God has foreknowledge of all choices that have been made, because all choices are immediately present to his awareness. This reminds me, in fact, of a wonderful story about St. Padre Pio. One time he was seen praying, and one of his students came to him and they said, Padre Pio, who are you praying for? And he goes, he says, I'm praying for Pope Leo such and such. And his disciple said, well, why would you pray for him? He's been dead for well over 300 years. And Padre Pio, he smiled and he says, all times are present to God. Right? So that St. Padre Pio was praying as if present to something that had taken place in the past. This is a mystical dimension, right? And we encounter this when we speak about precognitive dreams, right? Where in which you see future events as if they're happening right now. And this is an extraordinary mystery where we, in our conscious experience, see time as this, sequential series of events, whereas from the perspective of God, all times are present all at once, so that he transcends space and time. This is what's meant by saying God is Alpha and Omega, beginning and end. So there's a further insight that we can gain in regarding this relationship between God and the devil when we look at passages in the book of Exodus, which really is a book ripe with all kinds of seeming oxymorons, right? And my favorite, actually, and really the part of the Bible that really gave me a key insight into understanding this was Exodus chapter 4. We read in Exodus chapter 4, verse 24, that Moses is leaving Mount Sinai on his way back to Egypt, and God has just finished sending him, right? Moses in chapter 3 encounters the burning bush, and by the beginning of chapter 4, God is instructing him to leave Sinai and return to Egypt. And so midway through this chapter, we see Moses journeying on his way back. And then we read this. It says, at a lodging place on the way, the Lord met Moses and was about to kill him. But Zipporah took a flint knife, cut off her son's foreskin, and touched Moses' feet with it. Surely you are a bridegroom of blood to me, she said. So the Lord let him alone. At that time, she said, bridegroom of blood, referring to circumcision. Now, if you read this passage within the context of the wider book, it's incredibly confusing because Moses, quite literally, only like a paragraph before this, was face to face with God at the burning bush. So if God was out to kill Moses, why didn't he just do it at Sinai? Right? Why is it only on his way back to Egypt that all of a sudden God changes his mind and says, I have to kill Moses? It doesn't make any sense. It's a complete oxymoron to the wider context of the text. Well, again, I don't think that this is God acting at all so much as it's in fact the devil. This is a Satan, this is a demon that has legalistically found that Moses did not fulfill his obligation to the covenant of Abraham, and then seeks to kill Moses as a direct consequence. The devil is trying to thwart the plan of God. He's trying to thwart the activity of Moses and kill him on the basis of legalistic terms. But if that's the case, then why is this described as the Lord? Well, we've established that already by looking at the book of Job, right? That Job says, the Lord has taken these things. So the will of God is manifested even in the activities of the devil. But it also reveals something about the activity of the devil, because look at the basis for the devil's activity. He's trying to kill Moses on the basis of what? His inability or his unwillingness or his failure to fulfill the covenant, and his failure to fulfill the law that was set down by his father Abraham. This becomes a key insight, and we're going to continue deeper with this. If we look at the roots of the Hebrew word Satan, right, it comes from this root, this word shaitan, right, which in the Hebrew language is best translated as adversary, accuser, right? So essentially, I always like to say, the image of the devil that's best called to mind is the image of a lawyer, a prosecutor, right? A prosecutor in a court of law who comes in and says, such and such an individual is guilty and they deserve such and such a punishment, right? Now, there's something else I want to point out in Numbers chapter 22, verse 22, where we read, but God was very angry when he went, and the angel of the Lord stood in the road to oppose him. Balaam was riding on his donkey, and his 2 servants were with him. Now, to give you some context into what's happening here, Balaam has been hired by King Balak to come and curse the nation of Israel. He's riding on his donkey when suddenly the angel of the Lord appears to kill him. And it says in the story that the donkey refused to go any further, and so Balaam Balaam's life was saved. But what's interesting is that you lose something here by reading this passage in English, and I'm going to show you what I mean. If you read this in the original Hebrew, what it actually says is that the angel stood in the road to act as Satan, la Satan. Literally, the angel of the Lord has become the Satan. You know, this is something you lose in the English, right? Wait a minute. How can the angel of the Lord be acting as Satan, right? Well, it's the exact same activity that we see in Exodus chapter 9, verse 12, where we read, "But the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart, and he would not listen to Moses and Aaron, just as the Lord had said to Moses." This is an oxymoron. I mean, why would God harden Pharaoh's heart? We just established that God sent Moses to free the Israelites. Well, because again, we're speaking in terms of the providential will of God, where Satan is acting as an agent of this higher will that even he is not aware of. But in the case of this angel, right, this angel has come to oppose, to act as the adversary of Balaam. And so therefore he comes as the Satan, so that the angel of the Lord can even occupy this role, right, where we recognize that this is more of an activity than it necessarily is need be a personality. We even see this in Matthew chapter 16, verse 23, where it says, Jesus turned and said to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan." Okay, this is the first pope. I mean, this is the apostle of Peter, or this is the apostle of Christ, right? And Christ is calling him Satan. It's because Peter is trying to oppose Christ and fulfilling the will of God. He's acting as an adversary, right? He's standing in the way, trying to rebel against God's greater, higher will. And Jesus says, "Get behind me, Satan. You have only the things of human beings in mind and not the things of God." So we have to recognize, right, that this is a much bigger thing than just simply saying, you know, the devil is God's enemy. That's not it at all. Ultimately, God's will transcends even our rebelliousness. God's will transcends our sin. God's will and wisdom transcends everything that we can anticipate or think of, because God is infinitely further ahead of everything we choose to do. And so that even when the devil resists the will of God, he can't escape fulfilling it, because God is in all and through all and above all and truly worthy to be praised. We see this expressed again in the Gospels, where we read in Luke chapter 13, verse 16, "Then should not this woman, a daughter of Abraham, whom Satan has kept bound for 18 long years, be set free on the Sabbath day from what bound her?" So Jesus here is talking about the healing of a woman on the Sabbath day, and he says that her sickness is a form of bondage that was imposed on her by the devil. We read in John chapter 5, verse 14, "Later Jesus found him at the temple and said to him, 'You are well again, stop sinning, or something worse may happen to you.'" So you can see here that the work of the devil is working through the law. It's working through the obligation that is bound on humanity when we fail to fulfill some moral obligation. Now, this really gives us a profound insight into the writings of St. Paul, because if you look at the letters of St. Paul, he's always talking about the fact that the law is no longer something that Christians should follow, right? And it seems rather odd, because you look at the whole history of the Bible, and the law of Moses is of central importance. And then St. Paul comes along and says, not anymore, right? You've been freed from the law. You have no obligation to fulfill the commandment, because Christ, through his death, has liberated you from the law. In Romans chapter 7, verse 10, we read, "I found that the very commandment that was intended to bring life actually brought death." And in Romans 7, verse 6, we read, "But now, by dying to what once bound us, we have been released from the law, so that we serve in the new way of the Spirit, and not in the old way of the written code." So St. Paul stresses the fact in his epistles that those who tried to find salvation in God by fulfilling the law were met with endless frustration. Even Moses himself sins at the waters of Meribah and is obligated to die on Mount Nebo in light of the fact that he sinned against God. He sinned against, and this is Moses, for God's sakes, right? So if Moses can't fulfill the law, what chance have you and I got, right? And so St. Paul is addressing the fact that in the Old Testament, right, the Old Testament law, he tells us, was revealed by angels, right? Now, necessarily, if you look at this, okay, look at the role that the devil has played in the Old Testament. He's the accuser. So all of this violence that we're seeing in the Torah, is this violence there to appease God? No, it's there to appease the law itself, which the devil is using as a means for bringing chastisement on man. And we see this, that the devil really is the active wrath of God. In Isaiah, God says that he is using Assyria as the rod of his wrath, right? That the nation of Assyria is the means through which he punishes the world. Similarly, the devil's activity is the means through which God chastises the world. So for instance, when we look at passages like Numbers chapter 25, where we read, "And Israel abode in Shittim, and the people began to commit whoredom with the daughters of Moab. And they called the people unto the sacrifices of their gods, and the people did eat and bow down to their gods. And Israel joined himself unto the Baal of Peor, and the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel. And the Lord said unto Moses, Take all the heads of the people, and hang them up before the Lord against the sun, that the fierce anger of the Lord may be turned away from Israel. And Moses said unto the judges of Israel, Slay ye every one of his men that is joined unto the Baal of Peor." So that God is saying that you have to hang these people, you have to impale these people in the sun in order to do what? In order to turn the wrath of God away from Israel. Well, what did we just see in 2 Samuel and 1 Chronicles? What was the wrath of God? The activity of the devil. So that really, I think you could replace the wrath of God in here with the devil. The devil is seeking to destroy the nation. And as an accuser, he's coming in and he's saying, the people have prostituted themselves to the Baal of Peor. Death, death, death. Right? The devil wants blood. And this is the obligation that the law imposes on the people, that the people must present blood in order to appease the law. And it's the devil who's always coming in and reminding God, reminding the angels, reminding nature and humanity to say, blood, blood, blood. I want to see the blood, right? I want to see the fulfillment of this obligation, that if God's law stands as it stands, man deserves to die.
But the prosecution is not calling the defendants to account for violating constitutional guarantees or withholding due process of law. The prosecution is calling them to account for murder, brutalities, torture, atrocities. They share with all the leaders of the Third Reich responsibility for the most malignant, the most calculated, the most devastating crimes in the history of all mankind. And they are perhaps more guilty than some of the others.
And you have to recognize the malice of the devil in this, that the devil first tempts man into sinning. And once man commits the sin, the devil runs from the ear of the sinner back up to the court in heaven and then says, "You see, I told you, he's guilty. Now let me do what I want to do." Right? This is the malice of the devil. He's really out to destroy man, so that he tempts the sin, and when the man commits the sin, he's the first one to run up into heaven and say, "All right, Father, let me do it. Let me do what, needs to be done to bring chastisement down on these people," right? To bring down the blood, right? So this is really the activity of the law, and this is precisely what Christ came to liberate us from.
Anselm, who gave us this, he thought he was doing us a favor, and I understand. Because in the first 1,000 years, they saw this language in the scriptures. They said, well, who's this debt being paid to? And the normal Christian consensus in the first 1,000 years was it was being paid to the devil. I know, we don't think that way anymore, but it was a matter.
We read in Deuteronomy chapter 21, verses 22, "If someone guilty of a capital offense is put to death and their body is exposed on a pole, you must not leave the body hanging on the pole overnight. Be sure to bury it that same day, because anyone who is hung on a tree is under God's curse. You must not desecrate the land the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance." So you can see that, in the case of the Baal of Peor in Numbers chapter 25, as well as in Deuteronomy chapter 21, that when someone fails to uphold the law, the greatest curse that can fall on him is to be hung from a tree, to be impaled in the sun. And that's precisely what we see Christ fulfilling in the Gospels, right? So that this is really, this gives us an extraordinary insight into the providential plan of God, because what has happened here? What is the bigger picture in all of this? Basically, what's happened is that God, in his infinite wisdom, created man for relationship, but he also gave man freedom. And knowing with his full foreknowledge that man would leave and abandon him, he allowed the activity of the devil to step in and corrupt the world with sin and wickedness. But this was a necessary part in order to bring about the full revelation of God's goodness. Because what does God do? He puts a law out into the universe, a law of morality. And he says, this law stands. Now, he could have backtracked. He could have looked at the way that the devil was exploiting the law and said, you know what, I've changed my mind, Satan. I'm just going to change the law so that you can stop persecuting man. But he doesn't do that. He upholds the law. Not only does he uphold the law, but he assumes human nature and then does what? He fulfills his law. Jesus tells us, I have not come to abolish the law, but to fulfill it. Christ himself fulfills the obligation that man was incapable of fulfilling. He defeats the devil at every opportunity and crushes every temptation that the devil throws at him. And not only that, he takes upon himself the highest penalty of the law, as if he were the worst of sinners, so that in every aspect, God himself fulfills this cosmic law. God himself fulfills the covenant of Moses, and therein the devil's power is defeated. And so how does this salvation get shared with the world? Through faith, right? Jesus Christ invites us into this relationship, and through the Eucharist, through the bread and blood, through the body and blood of Christ, we come into a participation in this death, so that we share in the death of Christ. So that when the devil comes and says, I want to see the blood, I want to see the fulfillment of the law, the crucifixion is there, and the law is fulfilled. Right? It doesn't matter what sin you've committed. The worst possible punishment that can be imposed on anyone is being hung from a tree. And that's precisely what Christ allows the devil to do. And Christ was sinless. He was a blank slate. So any sins that we have can be put into that place. And this takes me back to Buddhism, right? Because the Buddhists even talk where they say karma is really just another word for cause and effect. If you commit a sin, it's only natural that some kind of suffering is going to emerge, because sin drives back the presence of God. And where the presence of God retreats, the activity of the devil moves in. And it's this activity of the devil that brings death, suffering, pain, and eternal condemnation. But thanks be to God that through Jesus Christ, the fulfillment of the law has been accomplished so that God could be all things in all possible ways. And he has set us free from the obligations to blood and death, and a death on a cross. Now, this really serves to, if you meditate on this and you really take the time to look at this, you can recognize why God allowed suffering in the world. Isn't it clear? Right? He allows suffering in the world in order to express this great glory, in order to express this great power and wisdom. St. Paul tells us that God allowed these things to show the many angles to the wisdom of God. So you say, why did God create the world with suffering and pain? In order to bring about this much higher revelation of his goodness. It'd be one thing if God created the world inherently good, and we could look and we could say, yes, the world is perfect, therefore God is good. But it's a very low level of goodness. What's much higher is to allow evil into the world, and through his providence, through his wisdom, through his power, to turn all forms of wickedness into goodness, so that the power, the wisdom, the majesty, and the glory of God can be manifested in the fact that even over a span of 4,000 years, his hand manipulates even the deepest darkness, even the most painful and ugly aspects of Israel's history. ever, always working together to bring about this fulfillment of the law that we see in Christ, and our full participation so that the law is upheld, the punishment of the law is upheld, justice is upheld, and God's love for humanity is upheld, so that all things are upheld in the providential hands of God. And the devil looks and realizes that he's nothing other than the architect of his own demise. He's a fool. He's a fool manipulated by the majestic hand of God, so that all things work together for the good of those who love God and obey his commandments. And as always, thanks for watching.